Hi, dear friends and cultural creatives. Bruce Lipton here. I want to welcome you to this very special edition of the Hay House Biology of Belief online course. In today's lesson, it's really about what's going on in the world around you. As you can see from the news and the headlines of the world, things are in a big state of upheaval. And yet there's something very interesting because there's a science and a biology underneath all of this that explains what is happening in the world and how we can thrive through all these changes. So the first thing we have to understand is this, that knowledge is power. And this is the point that I really want to emphasize in today's program for a very important reason, is that the knowledge that we grew up with, the knowledge about how genes control our lives and the fate of our biology and diseases, has now been transformed by all new sciences coming in. Specifically, the science of epigenetics, which we will go very deeply into, reveals your power in controlling your own genetics and your behavior. So as we move forward, what I really need you to see is that the crises that we face in this world, it's just really something telling us that we need to change. We can no longer keep living in the same way. So every day when you look at the newspaper and you see the headlines, terrorism or a crisis in economy or a crisis in fuel or a crisis in climate, I want you to recognize something very important. While we see each of these as individual crises, the real story is that all these crises come together in the sense of one overriding global crisis. And that crisis is we are no longer sustainable as a human population on this planet. We have undermined the ecosystems to such a degree that we're leading to a mass extinction because of the number of species that are disappearing every day. Today we're losing species at 1,000 times greater rate than it has been throughout history. And it reveals that we are facing some very large ecological problems that will alter human life on this planet. And it's interesting because we would like to say that, oh, this is just a natural consequence of planetary being and the solar system and all that. But no, we now know that human behavior is fundamentally undermining the ecosystem. In fact, the scientists now refer to this epoch, this period of time that we're in, as the Anthropocene. And that means, Anthropocene means that human action is altering the evolution of our planet. And that's because we've been undermining the entire ecosystem, the web of life. The way we've been raping the planet and taking its resources, the way we've been altering the habitats of organisms on this planet, we have greatly interfered with the normal expression of life. And therefore we have to recognize it's our behavior that must change. And when we look at our behavior, for example, we can see some of the great catastrophes that have recently occurred. For example, there was the great oil leak in the Gulf of Mexico not that long ago. And while people think that it's all cleared up, they actually haven't understood that the oil is still at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico and is wiping out life every day. In fact, the largest area of the Gulf of Mexico around Louisiana is called a dead zone because nothing can grow there anymore. Well, that's one of the ways we're altering life on this planet. Another one, as you might be familiar with, is the Fukushima nuclear plant accident that happened after the tsunami. Now, again, why is this relevant? Because human behavior did not plan on the consequences of destruction of a nuclear plant and the release of radioactivity that is now flooding through the Pacific Ocean and moving toward North America and South America. Again, this is changing the life in the ocean. It's killing species very quickly and altering others as much. Something else that we're facing right now is major climate change. And in this illustration, which is a picture of a glacier in Alaska in 1941, you can see how very high packed the ice was at that time period. But then I say, well, what does it look like today? So here's a picture from the very same spot now 40, 60 years later, and look what we see. And all of a sudden we see that the glacier has disappeared. And why is this relevant? Because where did the water go? And the answer is it's going into the sea. And glaciers all around the planet are going into the sea, and the water level is rising, and it's threatening human civilization. So basically we're coming down to a very important insight, and that is this. As the headlines reveal, we're facing the sixth mass extinction of life on this planet. 5 times in the history of Earth, life was thriving, and then it just got wiped out. And when we look at the nature of what was causing the destruction of life, In history, the 5 previous mass extinctions have been attributed to things like comets or asteroids hitting the Earth and upending the entire environment and, of course, wiping out life. Also, there were periods of massive geological activity on the planet, earthquakes and volcanoes all over the surface of the planet, which again wiped out life. But today, we're finding that we're losing species of organisms on this planet faster than in the previous 5 mass extinctions. But there's something more grave about the cause of this 6th mass extinction, and that is simply this. Science has recognized that the extinction we're facing now is due to human behavior. And so really it is incumbent upon us to start recognizing that we are involved with the fate and future of this planet. Interestingly, NASA scientists have recently come up with a massive study that revealed that within several decades, which to me means 10 to 20 years, that civilization is going to face an irreversible collapse. So all of a sudden the science recognizes that human civilization is heading toward an end. And basically we can talk about this collapse of civilization, and most people are focusing on all the fears and the threats of such a collapse. But I want you to recognize something more important, and that is crisis ignites evolution. And why is this important? Because the crises that we're facing, the crises that we're facing today, can only be resolved by changing the way we live on this planet, which means we are being forced into creating another way of life, another way of humans to behave toward each other and toward this planet. And while we are facing this extinction phenomena and the loss of so-called civilization, we must recognize this as well, that in the history of Western civilization, yes, civilization has collapsed, but civilization has been rebuilt many times over and over again. So when we review Western civilization's history, we see this is not the first time a civilization has faced crises that has caused it to change its belief systems. So as we look back over time, for example, I can tell you the civilizations that have come and gone before today's current civilization. Civilization was referred to as animism. And what that meant was this. These were people, the indigenous people who lived on the planet. And how they treated the planet was really interesting because they treated the planet as both a spiritual and a physical entity and learned to live in harmony with both. But that civilization ended when a new civilization called polytheism came in. And polytheism brought us the Greeks, the Egyptians, and the Romans. And polytheism itself is a civilization. Yes, the Roman civilization collapsed. And what happened in its place is civilization didn't end, just a new civilization was created, and that was the civilization that was referred to as Judeo-Christian monotheism. This is when the church was running civilization. And yet, even that civilization crashed. And that was around 1860 when Charles Darwin entered the scene. That was when the church's control of civilization gave way to science controlling civilization. You say, well, what is all these controls related to? Why does one end and why does another one begin? Well, the answer is very basically this, that the civilizations that we're talking about are all based on how they dealt with the 2 realms of the universe. The 2 realms of the universe? Yes, there's the physical material realm in which you're living right now, but there's also an invisible realm, an energy realm, a spiritual realm that is also present. And this has been known by the ancients. So from the beginning of time of human civilization, the population had to deal with the nature of 2 realms of life, the invisible spiritual realm and the material realm. The story I'm going to unfold for you really reveals how the belief in spirituality, or the belief in what we call materiality, changes over time, and when these beliefs change, so does civilization change along with it. So let's look at civilization as a living system, because it is. It's made out of people, and living systems all have a characteristic. Living systems have a birth, a maturation, a maturity, and then a decline. And we can talk about it as the life cycle. So when we talk about a life cycle of a civilization, what we can see is that over time, a civilization originates, it develops, matures, and then goes into decline. Interestingly, that's the same image that can be used talking about a human. We are born, mature, and then ultimately decline. So I say, okay, let's look at the growth and death of a civilization. The first part of a civilization's life is the development part. The development part is really important because in the development of a civilization, the people are trying out new beliefs, new ideas, new ways of life, trying to live in harmony. And the significance about that is we are creating a new vision as a civilization is getting off the ground. As the beliefs start to become concrete and actually formalized, then the civilization is taking on its more mature shape. As we start to recognize, when we get into the very mature shape of that civilization, it's a rigid belief system that has been acquired over that developmental period. So we buy into beliefs and we say, these are the beliefs of the world, and this is how the universe works, and this is how people work, etc., etc. So actually what we enter into is a period of rigidity. Rigidity in not changing our beliefs very easily, buying into our beliefs as absolute truths and trying to live to those truths. There's only one problem about being rigid in the universe, and that is this: nothing in the universe ever stays the same. The universe is dynamic and ever-changing and moving. So a civilization that gets into a rigid belief system actually leads to what are called challenges. And the challenges are the things that cause a population to see that their belief system is really not supporting them. That's when the civilization starts to collapse, because the crises that result from rigid beliefs not adapting to an ever-changing universe cause us to find ourselves in a state of disrepair, so to speak, that the civilization is not working. We go into that decline. Well, you say, okay, the civilization was born and matured, it got rigid, faced challenges, and then went into decline, so then it should be all over with. I go, no. Because as the civilization is in decline, what's happening is a new civilization is being created. And this new civilization is based on what are called cultural creatives. People who are looking for answers outside of the box, looking for new ideas, new insights into living in this world to help us survive, and more than just survive, actually to thrive into the world. And in fact, if you're watching this video, I'd like to thank you and acknowledge you because you represent a cultural creative. You are seeking answers outside of the box to look for resolutions to the crises that we face today. And that's why I'm excited to be here, because I'm going to hopefully provide you with some of those answers to help us move on. So, the civilization that we're in is coming to an end, but don't worry, because we're also creating the new civilization at this moment, and you are the participants in that project. As cultural creatives, I really want to thank you because you are the people that are going to lead us from today's crisis into the world that we can thrive in tomorrow. To understand the nature of why civilization is changing and what creates a civilization, the beliefs behind it, we have to go back and recognize that there are two realms to the universe, the invisible realm and the physical realm. And what we've seen over evolution is a change in which realm is emphasized by the people of a civilization. In other words, some civilizations are more into the spiritual aspect of life, and other civilizations are more into the material realm of life. So if actually I wanted to address a civilization and ask them a question, how much of the population believes that spirituality is really the primary source of their life experience, or ask them how much of the population believes that the material realm really represents their life experiences, we'll see that over time the proportion of populations change. So in this illustration of a gradient, at the bottom of the gradient where it's white, let's just say this is asking a population if you believe in spirituality. And if they don't believe in spirituality, then they'll be down at the bottom of the gradient, meaning they don't believe in it. But as you get more and more people believing in spirituality, and a greater proportion of the population believes in it, then we're moving deeper up into the yellow of that gradient. So it's a range. At the bottom, people really don't think spirituality is that important. And at the top, they believe that spirituality is everything. While I show a gradient of spirituality, I can also show a gradient of material belief systems. And this is a reverse gradient because it's white at the top and it goes to dark blue at the bottom. And what I mean by this gradient is that if I ask an individual, do you believe the material realm is more important than the spiritual realm? Well, then what we're going to see is this. If they don't believe the material realm is important, then we're going to see that they're at the top of the gradient in the white part. But as more and more of the population starts to recognize the importance of the material realm, then we start to see that the population gets greater and greater into the matter zone, and they're now at the bottom of the gradient. So I have two gradients in reverse, spirituality moving upwards and materiality moving downwards. Well, it's kind of hard to look at both gradients at the same time, so the best thing we can do right now is bring the two gradients together and look at it as just one chart. So we have a midline. Above the midline, we go towards spirituality, where a population believes that spirituality is predominant in their life. Below the midline is where a population believes that the material plane is more important in their life. So I say, okay, good. Now I say, but how do I know what the population believes? Well, here's an interesting understanding, is that there have been questions about human civilizations that have been asked for over 10,000 years. These questions are referred to as the perennial questions. The three main questions are, how did I get here? Why am I here? And lastly, how do I make the best of it now that I'm here? Well, what's significant is when somebody offers answers to these questions and the population buys their answers, these answers shape the character of that civilization. And also, whoever we buy the answers from for those three questions, we also seek them out for questions about anything about life because they represent civilization's truth providers. So, the character of a civilization, perennial questions, how did we get here? Why are we here? And lastly, how do we make the best of it? These answers constitute what is called the basal paradigm. And what I mean by that, paradigm is an idea, a blueprint. Basal means fundamental. So the basal paradigm are the fundamental beliefs that shape a civilization. So I say, okay, let's go back 10,000 years ago and ask the population how they see spirit and matter as relevant to their lives. And when we go back 10,000 years ago, what do we find? We find that animists were here, the indigenous people, the Indians of North and South America, the Aborigines in Australia, the Druids in Europe, wherever there were indigenous people. combination of the sky's sunlight with the Earth's matter created the chemistry that gives rise to life. So yes, the native belief
over
system,
time,
Father,
even the
Sky,
polytheistic
Mother Earth
cultures found their own crises that led to their own
And then you say, well,
demise.
why are you here?
And it's interesting because
And
as
the answer they
polytheism was
came up
fading
with
away,
is
a
they
new
were
belief
here
system was
to
coming in
tend
and
the
creating a
garden.
new
So
civilization.
they saw
The
themselves
new civilization
as
is based on
organisms
what we call
within the garden living in
Judeo-Christian
harmony with the garden
monotheism.
and maintaining
What's interesting
that
about
garden.
this figure, it shows
And then
the
you would ask
representation
them,
of
well, how
God
do you make the
as a
best of
human.
it? Well,
And their answer was
instilling
simply
life
this,
into
was
Adam
to
with that
learn
famous
to live
picture where
in
their two
harmony
fingers are
with
just
nature.
about touching each
And
other.
this was really
and why is this
the
relevant?
belief
Because the belief system
that
now
cultivated
is that life
how
is
they
imparted
lived on the
planet,
through
how
the
they
direct
formed community,
intervention
how they
of
related
God,
to each other, and
that there's a
specifically
divine
how they
intervention
related
that
to the
gives
planet
us the
itself.
spark of life, and that's what it
So
illustrated.
this was a very beautiful
Well,
time.
there's another
in our
interesting
history.
story
It was a
behind
very
this
peaceful time.
Judeo-Christian
And
belief system,
recognize
that is
this.
this.
In this world,
Remember, animus
and that belief
saw every
system,
object in the world as
everything
being
that was
spiritual.
matter was
And then we went
also
into
spiritual,
polytheism,
as I said, from a
and we
blade of
saw
grass
that
to a human.
the objects
Everything
lost their
had both
spirituality,
matter and
but
spirit.
were coalesced into
But things
gods,
changed
which
over
still
time.
lived on the planet.
And what happened over time
This
was
new version
the new
of
beliefs
civilization,
came in, new beliefs
Judeo-Christian
that led to
monotheism,
polytheism,
was then
and I said, well,
another
what does that
extension
really
of that.
represent?
And
And
what
the answer
happened
is simply
here
this.
is, rather than a series of gods,
animism,
all the
every
gods were put
individual
into
object
one
had its own
unique
spiritual
supreme
connection.
being. And
But
that
polytheism
supreme
changed
being
the
didn't
story
even
a bit.
live on this planet.
Rather than every
So
blade
what
of
you have
grass
seen
having
now
spirit
over the
in it, they
civilizations
created a
changing
god
is they
of
lost
nature,
of
the
God of
material
plants,
realm
as
a
being
god of
relevant,
water,
and more
a god
and
of
more
trees.
of our emphasis
They had a god for
going
all
into
of these different objects
appeasing
in our world.
the invisible
So they took the
spiritual realm.
spirituality out
So
of the individual.
now then we look at the chart
and put that
and we see
spirituality
very
into
interestingly
figurehead
that
gods.
as we progress
And
into
then they started to
Judeo-Christian
worship the
monotheism,
gods,
we
which
now
meant they
move
started paying
deeply
less attention to the
into
physical
spiritual
world
realm,
and putting
where
more
almost
emphasis
all of the
on
population
gods
believed that
and the
spirituality
spirit of
was
the world.
everything. So,
and in fact,
we
that
can talk about
matter
Mount Olympus,
was
for
not
example, where all
even
these gods
considered
aggregated
near
and hang out.
spirituality,
But
matter
interestingly
was to be
enough,
damned.
they were still connected
And
to the
the
earth.
whole
The
idea
gods were
about
here
this
on the
was a
earth.
belief that your
So,
spiritual
I said, well,
essence was
okay,
the important
there was
part
a
of you,
removal of
and that it was
spirituality
here
from
to live out
individuals
what
and
are
a
called
coalescence
plays
of
morality
that you
into
came to this
individual
physical
gods.
world to see
I go,
if you
yes,
were
this
worthy
is really
enough
very critical.
to go
And I say,
to
well,
that
what's the
spiritual
consequence of
ending
that? And I
place.
say,
So
when we
called
look at the
heaven,
chart of
in the
spirituality and
celestial garden
materiality,
somewhere.
what we start to notice
And why
is
this becomes
the population
relevant
is moving from the
is
midline
because
balance
now
where
we
animism
start
was
into the range of
emphasizing spirituality
everything.
over.
So I say,
the
okay,
material
well, let's
plane.
first look
So I
at
say,
the
okay,
nature of
let's go back
the
and now say,
perennial
what were the
questions,
basal
how the
paradigm
answers
beliefs, the
changed
cultural
in
beliefs that
Judeo-Christian
shaped
monotheism.
this
How
civilization?
did we get here? Well, as
number
we
one,
mentioned, for example, the
divine
Greeks said,
intervention.
how did we get
A
here?
direct,
They say we got here
effect
through
God
chaos
himself.
And you go, well, you got
Number
here through
two,
chaos.
why
What does
are
that
we
mean?
here?
Said, well,
As mentioned,
what they meant
we're
was
here
that
to live out
there was
plays
just
of
this
morality.
big jumble of
That is,
stuff,
to
and
see
then all of a
if
sudden
we
it
can
shaped up
walk
into the
through this
universe as we
world,
saw.
keep
And
ourselves
you go,
on
well,
a
that's
high enough
interesting, but it's
plane
not the same
so that
story
when we
as
leave this
the First
world,
Nations
we can
people.
go
I go, yeah, but
freely
it's still
into the gates of
scientific.
heaven.
You say, well, how can
So
both of them be scientific?
our
Because I can
actions
say
on this world
the Greeks
were
had
really
a vision
governing
of
whether
the
we
earth
will
before
be
the
able
earth.
and what they
meet
saw was
God in
what
heaven
we
at
would
some
call
future
today
time.
the Big Bang.
I said, well, then how
They
do you
saw
make
that
the best
out
of
of
the
it, the third
invisible energy,
question.
chaos of
And
the energy
the answer was simply
precipitated
this,
the physical
laws
plane.
of the
So
Bible.
their
So basically,
idea
we started
that we came
to
from
live by
chaos
rules that
is
were
actually
pronounced
justified
in
in the
today's
written
text of the
cosmology
Bibles.
about the nature
And
of
we
the Big Bang
gave
and the
our
precipitation
power
of matter
over
to
from
the church
energy.
for a very simple reason.
So I say,
and
okay, the
reason
source
is simply this.
is chaos.
Remember,
And then you ask them,
whoever we
well,
get the answers
why are you
from
here?
that we
Well, the
accept
answer is very
for the
hard
basal
to
paradigm.
find
We
for a
make
very
the
simple reason.
provider of
If we
those
got here from
answers
chaos,
the supreme
where
truth
was the
provider
plan?
for our
So all of a sudden you
civilization.
say, well,
So
there was no
now,
specific
once Judeo-Christian
reason that they could
monotheism
see
took
for us to
over,
be here.
if you had any
that third
questions
question
at all
was
about
specifically
life,
this.
the first
How
thing
do
you
we
do
make
is
the
you
best
go
of
see
it?
the man
And
in
the
the black
answer
coat,
they had, which is
because
kind
he
of humorous,
represented
is,
the voice of
don't
the church.
anger the
and the
gods.
voice of the church was
And
claimed
you go,
to
well, that's
represent
interesting,
the
and I
direct
mean,
voice
it
of
makes
God.
sense in a
So,
degree.
the
But
church had
what do you mean,
was
don't
called
anger the gods?
infallible
And
knowledge.
here's what the catch
And
was.
this was the knowledge
In
which
those
ran the world
cultures,
at that time.
the gods
There's
could
something
take on
very
any
important
form.
about
any shape.
absolutes,
They could
and
become
especially when
anything.
it comes to
They could
power.
become your pet
Because
dog.
when you
They
talk
could
about
become your
absolute
neighbor.
power,
And the whole
you're
idea about
talking
it is what?
about
Well, since you
absolute
never knew
corruption.
who or what
It's
a
the
God
corruption of
was,
power,
then you
when
were really
individuals hold all the power in their
coerced,
hands.
more or less.
And so the
to live
relevance
in
about
high
that
is
honor
that
on this
the
planet
church
and
started
respect
to
everything, because
feed
the last
off
thing you
of
want
the
to
people
do is
that it was
disrespect
serving.
God.
It
So
took
you had
away
to
their
recognize
possessions,
everything
claiming that
or
the material
everyone could be a
possessions will
god, and that
divert
really
them from their
controlled
track
going
the
toward
behavior
heaven,
of
and that
people, so that
earthly
they would
things
live
shouldn't
in
be in their
harmony
way,
and
happiness
matter
with
was
each other.
damned.
The
And it was
polytheistic
really
civilization was
interesting
unique because they separated
the church
spirituality
really said,
from the individual
give
and
us all
coalesced
your
them into
possessions,
gods,
the
and
gods
then
that
we
will
could
save
seek
you. And
answers
this is
from about how to
unfortunately
live
part
on
of
this
the
planet.
absolute corruption that led to the crisis of this particular form of civilization. However, the civilization didn't collapse, but instead there was a change, a transformation, a reformation. And this was actually due to Martin Luther. Martin Luther, who claimed that the church was really violating the rights of the individuals and taking too much power and actually usurping the health and activity of the people that they served. Martin Luther put his questions on the church door and said, challenge the church's belief. Well, this led to a change in the population, but it didn't lead to a change in what is called the basal paradigm. We still have the same belief about God and divine intervention and the laws of the Bible, but with a slightly different take, because the Protestants had another look at the nature of materiality, and that was simply this. Rather than being damned, the Protestants saw that having possessions might reflect God's gift to you, that if God loves you, God will give you things. And all of a sudden, then having possessions was no longer a damned part of life, but it was actually a recognition of your alignment and allegiance with the Holy Spirit. So the Protestants said, yes, possessions are not so bad. And as you can see from the chart, when the Reformation came, we moved from the high point where everything was spiritual and are moving back down toward the material plane. Well, this opened up a lot of opportunity to challenge the church in different ways. And the church felt this challenge and was really antagonistic to the Protestants for taking away the herd. So the church was really interested in rebuilding their image to the public. One of the most interesting and important aspects of why people end up going to church turned out to be the festivals and the holidays. So the church started to see, wow, we should really emphasize these special holidays and festivals to bring more people back into the church. Well, there was a problem with trying to understand how to program these festivals and holidays for this very simple reason. Some of the holidays were on a yearly cycle, a sidereal cycle, meaning every 365 days. So, for example, the birth of Jesus in the literature is on December 25th, and it's always on December 25th every year, so everybody knows when that festival or holiday is going to be celebrated. However, there were other holidays that were actually tied to the lunar cycle. So, for example, Easter is tied to a lunar cycle. It's not on the same day every year. It changes, and here's the reason why. The lunar cycle of 28 days does not evenly fit into a 365-day cycle. So the two cycles are not in harmony. And this is where the church ran into a problem. How could they schedule these special holidays that were on a lunar cycle and put it into the yearly calendar cycle? Well, they were at a loss. So what did they need to do? They needed to find somebody who could help them guide the understanding of the calendar to a much higher degree. And what they found was a priest who was an astronomer by the name of Nicholas Copernicus. Copernicus was even more than an astronomer. He was a medical doctor as well. I say, so what did they ask of Copernicus? They said, look, can you look at the stars in the sky and tell us how we can program the holidays and the festivals so that all of the churches are celebrating at exactly the same time? Well, Copernicus takes this vision back to his place and looks at the world, looks at the stars, and realizes something very important. That in the Bible, the earth is the center of God's firmament, that the moon, the planets, the stars all revolve around the earth. The earth is the center of the universe. Well, the problem is when Copernicus was trying to map the stars and time, he realized that it just didn't fit. It just didn't work this way. But he went back to an older period. He went back to the polytheists. He went back to Egypt. And he found that there was an understanding there that the earth was not the center of the universe, that we were just a planet moving around the sun and among all the other stars, which are suns in the universe. Once the infallible nature of the church was broken by Copernicus's work, In the last section, we learned that even with deist beliefs built into the Declaration of Independence, the church was still running the world. And that was until 1859, when Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species. And I say, well, why was this so interesting? And the answer is simply this. Remember, science was still building itself up under the church's dominance, but creating miracles nonetheless. Interestingly, this new science offered an opportunity to enter into the basal paradigm because Darwin's story gave us an answer to the first question, which science never had. The first question in the basal paradigm is, how did we get here? And Newton's science, with all the miracles it produced, was not able to answer that question. And until science could come up with an answer to how we got here, it was not in competition for the truth provider of this world. But with Darwin's work, all of a sudden the public could see very quickly belief in evolution really overwhelmed the belief in the magic of a 7-day unfolding of Genesis. And the reason why the people gravitated to Darwin's belief so quickly was simply this. Back in the days of no TV, no Game Boys, no toys, what did people do for recreation? Well, one of the biggest sources of recreation was breeding animals and plants. And what they saw in those breeding experiments is exactly what Darwin emphasized as the origin of species. Darwin's origin of species is simply this, is that an organism appears and it's a variant of its parents. And that variation, being weird, could go on, and if bred with other variants, could lead to variations so great that they depart from the original species. Well, this is the foundation of evolution. We start with a species, and then through reproduction and variation, you give rise to variants that ultimately lead to new species. This was built into the theory. I say relevance was simple, is that the public was already aware of the fact that by breeding plants and animals, you get the occasional weirdo in the litter, the runt of the litter, so to speak. And so it didn't take them very long to say, yes, if you take these runts and you move them in their own line and reproduce them, they could lead to something totally different. So the interesting aspect, their familiarity, the people's familiarity with the nature of breeding plants and animals at that time, allowed them to rapidly accept the story offered by Charles Darwin. So while his book was released in 1859, by 1869, the world has bought into his belief system about life and left the church's beliefs behind. We move from the original paradigm where monotheism claimed divine intervention into a new paradigm, a new belief that says that we got here through random mutations. And you go, wow, okay, first question answered by science. We got here through variations of mutations or alterations in heredity that are perpetuated through reproduction. People bought into it and said, fine. And yet, we then have a problem because the second question that comes in the basal paradigm is, why are we here? And then we hark back to the nature that the key step in Darwinian theory, the first step, is the creation of a variation in heredity. Today we refer to those variations as mutations, and they were referred to as random mutations, accidental mutations. You say, well, what's the relevance? I say, how can you ascribe purpose to evolution when evolution was driven by accidents of genetics? And all of a sudden you say, well, oh my God, we have no purpose according to that belief. We just got here by the accidental shaking of genetic dice, so to speak. And all of a sudden it says, wow, there's no answer for our purpose. We have no purpose. But they did have an answer for the third question, how do you make the best of it? And the answer was to recognize that to be the survival of the fittest in the struggle for existence. That it was not a civilization built on the principles of morality of religion. It was built on a competition. And basically it said that in our world today, that there's a rat race, a dog-eat-dog world. Why? Because the Darwinian theory incorporates the belief last section, we learned that the theory of evolution proposed by Darwin was based on changes in heredity. But it's very important to note that Charles Darwin and the scientists at that time had no concept of the nature of genes. In fact, they believed there were particles called gemmules, which were more like little paint droplets scattered around the body that were responsible for programming each part of the body. And that when two people would mate, the paint gemmules structures would come together and merge, and therefore the traits of the parents would be expressed in the offspring. However, while no knowledge about genes was understood by Darwin and his contemporaries, at the same time, in work in Middle Europe by Gregor Mendel on breeding plants and flowers, revealed a new insight into the nature of heredity. As I said, it was believed that hereditary factors would merge like paint and blend with each other. But this is what Mendel found out. When he would breed two plants, one with a white flower and one with a red flower, that the offspring, many of them were all pink. So there was a mixture of the white and the red. And this still conformed to the idea of gemmules. However, the world changed when Mendel started to mate the offspring, the two pink offspring together. So he took two offspring that were pink, mated them, and guess what? 25% of the flowers were white, 25% were red, and 50% were pink in the offspring. What was the relevance? The traits didn't blend together. They were still there as separate entities. The white gene was still expressing at whiteness, even though they didn't know it was a gene at the time. The red was still being expressed as red. And so even though they were combined in the hybrid, they were able to separate out when the hybrids were mated. So all of a sudden it said that the units of heredity appeared to be discrete units that did not blend with each other but maintained their characteristics. And this was the first insight into the nature that there is a hereditary molecule in there that keeps its character in spite of being hybridized in mating situations. So in other words, the units of heredity were discrete particles of some kind. But what were they? Well, the answer wasn't clear yet, but in 1892, great insight was provided by a scientist by the name of August Weismann in Germany. Weismann was using microscopy, which was relatively newly developed in the last century, and using new techniques, he was able to actually study cells that were dividing. And what he noticed that when cells would divide, that in the center between the dividing cells, long filaments would start to aggregate, and that these filaments then were pulled apart, with half of the filaments going into one daughter cell and the other half of the filaments going into the other daughter cells.